The first time he said it, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Please, Glinda, you'd never survive without me," slipped out as casually as if he were ordering dessert, and the room seemed to tilt just a few degrees, just enough to make every framed photo feel as though it might slide off the wall. I remember the faint clink of his cufflink against the glass, the scent of his cologne threading through the air, like a signature he wanted me to breathe. I felt my body still a reflex honed after years of keeping our life smooth and unwrinkled for company, for clients, for whatever audience his job demanded that week. I smiled because that's what I'd been taught to do when a blow arrives dressed as a compliment. He didn't notice the way my fingers tightened against the stem of my water glass, the tiny tremor I hid by setting it down with care. He kept talking about restaurants we should try and suits he needed for a gala, while his sentence replayed in my head like a quiet alarm I could no longer silence. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories about quiet justice and second chances speak to you, tap like and subscribe, so more of us can sit together in this circle. My name is Glinda, and I design the kind of things people drive across, without thinking bridges ramps the quiet bones that carry a city from one shore to the next. I grew up in a small Midwestern town with a mother who filed books with reverence and a father who believed you fix what you can and you leave what you can't better than you found it. Dinner at our house was the opposite of glamorous. It was dependable the way a well-poured foundation is dependable no matter the weather above it. I was the girl with a pencil behind her ear and a pocket notebook full of angles and sketches, the one who could lose an afternoon to a model kit and emerge soothed hands dusty with possibility. I learned to trust quiet work, the kind that doesn't need applause to stand. Richard arrived like a skylight in a dim hallway, and I was grateful for the light. He knew how to walk into a crowded room and bend it toward him without seeming to try the way wind redirects a plume of smoke. He spoke in stories and outcomes, in wins and visibility, and I admired his ease even when I didn't fully understand the game. He told me I was brilliant, and then he told me how to present it. He praised my work, and then he suggested a better dress, a sharper heel, a smile that read more approachable problem solver and less focused engineer. If I bristled, I smoothed the bristle myself, because conflict at home always felt like a poorly timed lane closure, avoidable if you plan your route with enough care. I told myself it was love adjusting itself to fit the way trusses settle under their load and find equilibrium. When he moved into my apartment, his world came, with him sleek decanters, brass lamps that photographed well, and a wheeled cart for effortless entertaining that never once felt effortless to me. He reorganized the kitchen with the confidence of a foreman declaring the old layout inefficient, while he slid the knives into a magnetic strip and banished my mismatched mugs to a donation box. Our weekends shifted too. My coffee dates with college friends were replaced by rooftop gatherings where strangers hugged me like we'd shared a childhood, and someone always seemed to be angling for a contact, a mention a step up, another social stare. If I missed the small comfort of familiarity, I swallowed it with the appetizers. He called this transformation, elevating our life, and I nodded because the path of least resistance is wide and well lit when you are tired. The only door he didn't open was the one to my spare room, where a folding table held a patient city of beams and cables in miniature. I worked there when the house fell silent, sanding edges threading the fine lines of suspension like stitching through a wound. Richard teased me for it. "Your tiny bridges," he'd say with a grin. But there was always something in his tone that felt like a finger on my forehead, keeping me at arm's length from my own joy. I told myself it didn't matter, that not everything had to be shared to be real. Still, I noticed how my shoulders dropped the moment the latch clicked behind me, and the world shrank to the gentle scrape of paper against wood. I wish I could say the trouble announced itself with fireworks. But it was quieter than that, more like hairline fractures that only reveal themselves when the sun hits at a certain angle. He corrected the way I told stories in front of his colleagues, not unkindly, just enough to make me hand the floor to him next time. He replaced the soft sweater I loved with something sharper and said, "Trust me, it communicates more." He called my comfort holding back, and my preferences bad habits. And it was easier to pretend he was right than to learn the feel of my own no. I told myself that every relationship is a negotiation, that compromise is love in work boots. And besides, look at our photos, we looked like a win. The day the email arrived from our European office, the subject line glowed like a dawn I hadn't dared to imagine. It was a project large enough to hang a decade on, the kind that moves your name from a cubicle to a conference table and keeps it there. I read it twice with my hand over my mouth, the way you do when a too long hope suddenly takes a seat right across from you. I heard Richard's keys in the hall and clicked the screen. Dark heart thudding against my ribs as if I'd done something wrong. He breezed in with a story about a client and a new rooftop bar we needed to try, kissed my cheek and set his phone on the counter like a gavel. I stood very still, tasting the copper of my own excitement, and wondered if I told him about the bridge waiting across the ocean, would he see me as a partner crossing it or a passenger he needed to chaperone? Richard didn't notice the way I went quiet when he talked. Not that evening, not on the days that followed. He filled every silence with plans of his own, pointing out apartments in Paris on his tablet, commenting on the view from the balconies and which streets would make the best backdrop for dinner parties. I nodded when expected, smiled when his eyes met mine, but inside I felt the faintest tremor begin. It was like a hairline crack in concrete, invisible at first, yet undeniable once you traced it with your finger. That sentence he had thrown at me, "You'd never survive without me," kept echoing in corners of my mind, where even he couldn't reach. It showed itself in small moments. At a dinner with friends from his circle, I mentioned a colleague's wedding overseas, and Richard cut in with a laugh. "Glenda doesn't do well without me. She'd be lost on her own." The table chuckled politely, and I laughed too, because what else could I do? But my stomach tightened, and I caught myself twisting the napkin in my lap until it nearly tore. Later that night, when I washed the wine glasses, I remembered his words and wondered how many times he had said them before disguised as humor, and how many more times I had let them pass. There was another night when he hovered by the doorway of my workshop holding his glass of red wine while I adjusted the cables on a small suspension model. "You know, once we're in Europe, you won't have time for these toys," he said, shaking his head as though I were a child wasting an evening. I smiled faintly, pretending it didn't sting, but inside, I held my breath until he walked away. Those models had carried me through long nights of study, through the years of proving myself in a field where not many women were given the lead. They were not toys. They were my testimony, and he never saw them as anything but clutter. By day, his control was polished, effortless, dressed in the language of improvement. He chose my dresses for events, smoothing the fabric against my shoulders and calling it presentation. He whispered reminders at my side before meetings with his contacts, suggesting when to speak and when to simply smile. Outwardly, it looked like partnership. To anyone else, it might even have looked like love. But I knew better. Love does not require a script, and I was growing tired of repeating lines I never agreed to speak. I found myself slipping into silence more often, not because I lacked words, but because I feared what would happen if I used them. Confrontation with Richard was never shouting or slammed doors. It was the sigh, the arched brow, the patient lecture about how I was limiting myself. It was being told that I should be grateful for his guidance, as though my own judgment was something fragile and unreliable. I hated the sound of my own voice shrinking into, "You're right," when every part of me knew he wasn't. It became clear when my sister Maya visited one weekend. She's a nurse, steady and practical, the kind of person who can make a room feel safe by just sitting down in it. She stepped into my apartment, looked around at the pristine shelves and curated prints, and said softly, "This place doesn't look like you anymore." I brushed it off, pointing to the new rug, to the view, to whatever detail might distract her. But her words clung to me long after she left. She had seen what I had worked so hard to ignore, that my life had been redecorated into someone else's vision. And somewhere along the way, I had gone missing in it. The real break came with the news of the promotion. When my boss called me in, his voice carried the kind of pride that made me feel 10 feet tall. A flagship bridge project in Europe, the sort of assignment that shapes a career. 2 years abroad, all expenses covered, a team waiting to be led. I walked home that evening, nearly trembling with joy, imagining the arches and spans that would bear my name long after I was gone. And then I told Richard. He didn't look up at first, just muttered about logistics and the inconvenience to his contacts. When I suggested I might go ahead alone for a short while to find my footing, his smirk sliced sharper than a shout. "Please, Glinda, you'd never survive without me." It wasn't jealousy in his eyes, nor even anger. It was disbelief, as if the idea of me thriving without his hand guiding mine was simply inconceivable. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a flare of rage. It was colder than that, steadier. The kind of decision that hardens without noise. I nodded that night, keeping my voice soft, letting him believe I'd agreed. But inside, I had accepted the truth I had been avoiding for years. He didn't see me as a partner. He saw me as a project, something to manage and polish, something that reflected him. And I was done being managed. I was an engineer. I built things meant to last, and now I would build a life without him. I started to notice everything more clearly after that. The way he rehearsed his stories before social events, practicing charm in the mirror. The way he brushed past me when he was focused, not cruel, but careless, as though I were a piece of furniture to be navigated. The way his mother's emails spoke only of his accomplishments, never once asking about mine, echoing the same imbalance he lived by. Every detail was another crack in the facade, and I saw it all now. The surface harmony I had clung to was gone, and in its place stood the truth I could no longer ignore. What unsettled me most was how calm I felt. I expected fear or anger or even grief. Instead, there was quiet resolve, the same kind I carried on work sites when weather threatened to undo months of planning. Hold steady, I told myself, like steel under tension. The project has begun, and the foundation must be set. I kept my smile, kept my silence, and let Richard keep believing he was indispensable. But inside, I was already drafting something he would never see coming. And so the days that followed unfolded like two parallel lives, one where Richard spoke of Europe as if it were his achievement, and another where I whispered to myself in the dark. Not much longer now. The truth had finally taken root, and I could no longer pretend not to see it. What he thought was dependence was nothing more than patience, and soon that patience would run out. It was only a matter of time before the blueprint of my escape began to take shape. Nights were the hardest. Richard would fall asleep within minutes, the steady rhythm of his breathing filling the dark, while I lay awake staring at the faint pattern of streetlight on the ceiling. My thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the words he had spoken, the smirk on his face, the easy confidence that I could not possibly manage without him. The quiet pressed down heavy, and in that silence I admitted to myself what I had refused to say out loud. I felt smaller than I ever had before. At work, I could direct a team, command, respect, solve crises without hesitation. At home, I found myself shrinking into shadows I didn't recognize. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, that the pressure of the move was weighing on both of us, but that excuse didn't soften the edges. Every time I caught my reflection, I saw it, the faint tension around my mouth, the way my shoulders curved inward, as though I were trying to take up less space. Even the little things wore on me. The sweater he decided was too frumpy found its way into the donation pile. My favorite mug disappeared, replaced by a set of matching porcelain cups he claimed were more presentable. Each change was small, but together they stacked high, and I was buried beneath them. There were moments I almost spoke up. One evening when he corrected me mid-story at a dinner, I felt the words burn at the back of my throat. I wanted to say, "Stop speaking for me. Stop deciding how I sound." Instead, I forced a smile and let the conversation sweep past me as though I hadn't been erased at all. Another night when he dismissed my models yet again as toys, I wanted to shout that those models carried more meaning than any of his curated parties ever could. But my voice caught, and all I managed was a small laugh before I turned back to my workbench, hiding the sting in the hum of sandpaper against resin. Maya called one Saturday afternoon, her voice warm but edged with concern. She asked how the preparations were going, if I was excited for the project overseas. I hesitated too long before answering. I wanted to tell her everything, that I was terrified that Richard's words still echoed in my head, that I wasn't sure who I was anymore, outside of his influence. But all I said was, "It's busy. Lots to get done." She didn't push, though. I could hear the pause on the line, the unspoken worry. When we hung up, I sat in the empty apartment with the weight of what I hadn't said pressing on my chest. The strangest part was how guilt kept creeping in. Richard wasn't cruel in ways that left visible scars. He bought flowers, left notes, kissed my forehead in public. He knew how to look like a good man, and sometimes I almost convinced myself he was. When I thought about leaving, even if only in whispers to myself, the guilt was quick and sharp. Who was I to complain when so many women had it worse? Who was I to want more than what I had? But then I would hear his voice again, that smug certainty that I couldn't possibly stand without him, and the guilt would burn into anger. I leaned on my models more than ever in those weeks. Late at night, I'd sit cross-legged on the floor of my workshop, carefully threading cables through the frame of the Golden Gate miniature. My hands shook sometimes, not from the delicacy of the task, but from the quiet storm in my chest. Each beam I glued felt like a reminder, a piece of proof that I could create something solid, something lasting with my own two hands. When I finished a section and stepped back to admire the structure, it felt like breathing again, like reclaiming a corner of myself Richard couldn't touch. Still, the pain seeped through in ways I couldn't always hide. At the office, Andrew asked if I was sleeping enough. He said I looked drawn, and I laughed it off with a comment about deadlines. At home, Richard's friends noticed nothing. They clinked their glasses, shared their stories, and Richard steered the spotlight as always. I played my part, the agreeable partner, with a smile, though my chest tightened with every false laugh. When I caught sight of myself in the mirror behind the bar one evening, I almost didn't recognize the woman smiling back. Her eyes looked tired, her smile brittle, and I wondered how long I had been wearing that mask. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or a single cruel act. It came in the smallest of moments when I realized I had stopped reaching for my own opinions. I caught myself waiting for Richard's cue before speaking, even in my own home, and the realization hollowed me out. I sat at my desk that night, hands resting on a stack of blueprints, and whispered, "This isn't me." The words sounded strange, like hearing an old friend's voice after years apart. I said them again, louder this time, until the truth settled in my bones. This wasn't me, and I couldn't keep living like it was. I didn't confront him, not yet. The thought of his dismissive sigh, the inevitable lecture, felt too heavy to face. Instead, I folded the truth into myself, a secret vow I carried quietly. I smiled when he suggested new suits, nodded when he mentioned farewell parties, laughed at the right moments. But inside, I was holding something firmer. I had seen the cost of silence, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. My patience had reached its limit, and though he didn't know it, I was already pulling back piece by piece, reclaiming space in my own mind. The nights remained long, but they began to feel different. Instead of lying awake with dread, I lay awake sketching outlines in my mind, not of bridges or towers, but of a future without Richard. The thought frightened me, but it steadied me too. For the first time in years, I could see the possibility of living by my own design, not his. I held on to that image even when doubt tried to creep back in, even when guilt whispered its familiar tune. Because somewhere beneath all the fear and exhaustion, I had finally admitted the truth. I wasn't broken. I was waiting. And soon, waiting would no longer be enough. The morning after that, whispered vow to myself. Something inside me felt different. I went through the motions, coffee brewing Richard's voice carrying from the living room as he made plans for a rooftop party, but beneath the surface, a steady calm had taken hold. It was as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that I no longer doubted the cracks were real. I couldn't ignore them anymore. Whatever guilt or fear had bound me was loosening thread by thread, replaced by a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. At the office, I accepted the promotion formally sitting across from Andrew as he slid the paperwork across his desk. His eyes met mine, searching, as though making sure I was ready for what this meant. "This is big, Glinda," he said, voice even but warm. I nodded, feeling the words catch in my throat. "I know," I answered, "and I want it." He gave a small smile, a look of recognition that went deeper than professional pride. I asked for discretion, explaining only that my personal situation was complicated. He agreed, without hesitation, telling me the relocation team would handle every detail quietly. Walking out of that office, holding the folder under my arm, I felt the weight of a new beginning pressing against my chest. That evening, I came home to find Richard sprawled on the couch, tablet in hand, pointing out neighborhoods in Paris. "We'll want to be close to the river," he mused, something with history character. I leaned over his shoulder, my smile fixed my heart steady. He thought I was standing beside him in this plan, when in truth, I was already moving beyond him. It was surreal, like acting in a play, where the audience knew the ending, but the other actor hadn't read the final page. He didn't notice the way I studied his face, memorizing the lines of arrogance that had once seemed like confidence. For the first time, I felt no pull to argue or to please. I just let him talk, knowing the truth was mine alone. In the weeks that followed, I lived in two separate worlds. By day, I was an engineer, preparing for a monumental project overseas, securing details with the relocation team, and setting the pieces in place for a clean transition. By night, I was Richard's partner in appearance, nodding as he spoke about farewell dinners, agreeing to plans that would never happen. It was an odd balance, exhausting, yet empowering, like holding two blueprints side by side, one false one, real. The false one would fade soon enough. The real one was etched deeper with every decision I made. Maya called again one afternoon, her voice lifting me out of the fog. She asked if I was still excited, if I had told Richard yet. I hesitated, the pause stretching long enough for her to notice. "Glinda," she said gently, "are you sure you're all right?" I swallowed hard, choosing my words with care. "I'm figuring it out," I told her, "but I think I finally know what I need." She didn't press, but the silence that followed carried her quiet support. I clung to that call like an anchor proof that I wasn't entirely alone in this. The closer we came to August, the more Richard's confidence grew. He told everyone in his circle about our move, spinning it as an adventure. He had orchestrated an opportunity that would elevate us both. He beamed when they offered congratulations, and I smiled beside him. The practiced mask never slipping, but inside something hardened each time. His version of the story left no room for me, no recognition that this was my achievement, my work, my future. It was as though he had convinced even himself that I was only along for the ride. And maybe that was what finally sealed it for me, the realization that he would never see me as anything but his reflection. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I packed small things into boxes, labeling them discreetly. My hands moved with the same precision I used on job sites, each piece placed with care, each step deliberate. I rehearsed timelines in my head, fitting them together like beams in a structure, checking for weaknesses. It wasn't fear driving me anymore. It was resolve. I had waited too long, let myself be diminished piece by piece, but not anymore. This time, I was building something for myself, and every hidden box, every silent arrangement was a step toward freedom. One evening, as I wrapped the delicate frame of the Sydney Opera House model, Richard appeared in the doorway. He swirled a glass of wine and watched me, that familiar smirk tugging at his mouth. "Still with those little projects?" he asked. I forced a smile, answering softly, "Just making sure they're safe." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Adorable, but once we're in Europe, you won't have time for that." I nodded, letting him think he was right. Inside, though, his words no longer stung the way they once did. They rolled off me like water on stone because I already knew he would never step foot in Europe by my side. The shift was complete now. Where I once felt guilt, there was clarity. Where fear had kept me quiet, resolve guided my silence. I could no longer ignore the truth. I had outgrown the role he had written for me. I was no longer waiting for permission or validation. The blueprint was already drawn, and for the first time in years, it was mine alone. As the days ticked down, I carried myself differently. Richard didn't notice. He was too busy planning a life that would never exist. But I felt it, a steady strength rising in me, quiet and unshakable. And with every passing day, I knew the moment was coming when the false blueprint would collapse, leaving only the real one standing. The first step was saying yes, quietly and without fanfare. I accepted the promotion and let the relocation team know I would need discretion, explaining only that my personal situation required care. From that moment, every action became part of a design, measured, deliberate, with no wasted motion. I moved through the apartment with a calm Richard mistook for agreement, all the while tracing lines in my mind, like blueprints, planning each exit point and structural support. He had no idea that I was already dismantling the life he thought he controlled. I started with the lease. One afternoon, while Richard was at a client lunch, I met with the landlord, my signature steady, as I handed over the 60-day termination notice. The date was set final, a countdown I carried silently in my chest. August 14th would be my departure, and by the very next morning, another tenant would hold the keys. I walked back into the apartment that evening and listened to Richard describe his day, nodding at the right places, all the while knowing our home no longer belonged to either of us. Next came the belongings. This was the part that required the most precision, because one misstep could unravel everything. I arranged through the relocation company for movers who understood discretion, giving them clear instructions. Items marked with blue tape were mine, bound for my new apartment overseas. Items marked with red were his, carefully packed and sent to a storage unit rented under his name. I prepaid the first 3 months, ensuring no accusation of cruelty could stick. It became a rhythm, wrapping my models in soft paper, labeling boxes with a steady hand, then tucking them back neatly so nothing looked out of place before he returned each night. Richard didn't notice. When I mentioned the relocation team stopping by, he barely looked up from his phone. "Make sure they don't scratch the marble table." He muttered, his attention fixed on an email thread about an upcoming gala. His indifference was my cover, his arrogance the perfect shield. I smiled and agreed, my voice calm, my heart steady all the while, knowing that marble table would be packed and stored, another artifact of a life I was leaving behind. The digital trail was next. At the post office, I filed the paperwork to redirect all my mail to the company address. I purchased a new phone under my own name, programmed to activate the moment I landed in Europe. The old number, the tether he held so firmly, would vanish with one click. Each step felt like tightening bolts on a bridge, making sure every connection was sound, every joint secure. I rehearsed the plan in my mind late at night, whispering to myself that all I had to do was hold steady until the day arrived. Guilt still surfaced at times, catching me when I least expected it. Richard wasn't cruel in public. He bought flowers, left notes, spoke of us as a team. To anyone else, I must have looked like a woman preparing for an exciting new chapter with a devoted partner. But I knew better. The private dismissals, the erasure of my choices, the smug certainty that I couldn't stand on my own, those were the quiet violences that wore me down. When guilt pressed too hard, I reminded myself of his words, that smirk, the way he believed my survival depended on him. It steadied me again, sharper than any reassurance could. I tested my resolve one evening as I packed the delicate frame of the Golden Gate model. Richard lingered at the doorway, wine in hand, and asked, "Still with your little projects?" I glanced up, keeping my tone light. "Just making sure they're packed safely." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Once we're in Europe, you won't have time for this." Too much to see, too many people to meet. I nodded, letting him think he was right. Inside, though, I felt a calm I hadn't known before. He underestimated me all the way to the end, and I no longer felt the need to correct him. The movers arrived on August 1st while Richard was out at lunch. They worked quickly, each box disappearing into trucks with practiced efficiency. Blue for me, red for him, every item placed exactly as planned. His Italian suits, his curated art pieces, his crystal decanters, all wrapped and delivered to the storage unit under his name. My models, my books, the sweater I had hidden at the back of the closet, all bound for the new apartment waiting across the ocean. When he returned that evening, he asked only if the movers had measured the wine rack. I smiled and told him yes, steady in the knowledge that everything had gone exactly to plan. The apartment grew emptier by the day, though he didn't notice. He was too busy planning farewell parties, too caught up in the story he had written for himself. He told friends that Paris would welcome us soon, that he had already secured introductions with people who mattered. I smiled and played along, keeping my voice steady, while inside, I whispered to myself, "Hold on, just a few more weeks." Each smile was another bolt tightened, another safeguard in place. On the 10th of August, I sat alone in my workshop, wrapping the final model, a delicate version of the Sydney Opera House. My hands lingered on the thin sails, tracing the edges with care. Richard appeared in the doorway, champagne in hand, raising his glass. To us, he said, grinning, "Paris, here we come." I lifted my glass to my lips, smiling as though I shared his excitement. I didn't drink. He thought I was celebrating our beginning, but I knew I was already at the end. The days that followed blurred together, a quiet march toward freedom. The apartment emptied, the paperwork was confirmed, and the flight was set. On the morning of August 14th, Richard dressed for what he called our farewell brunch, kissing my cheek before promising to be back by 6 so we could head to the airport together. When the door closed behind him, the silence filled every corner. I walked through each room one last time, the walls bare, the shelves empty. My passport and ticket rested in my bag, the plan complete down to its smallest detail. At 4 o'clock, I stood in the living room, the space echoing around me, and sent the final message. I told him where his belongings were stored, attached a photo of the key and access card, and wished him well. Then I dropped the phone into a recycling bin downstairs, severing the last tie. By the time he returned, expecting to collect me for the airport, the door would open to a stranger, the new tenant already settled. His confusion, his indignation, his voice rising in disbelief, I would not be there to see it. At 6:30, I would already be boarding, watching the city shrink to lights in the distance. As the plane taxied down the runway, I leaned against the window, feeling something I hadn't known in years. Not rage, not triumph, but a quiet calm, deep and unshakable. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "You said I couldn't survive without you. Watch me." And though the sky ahead was uncertain, I knew I had already crossed the most important bridge of my life. The real test would come once I landed, but for the first time in years, I was ready. The first morning in Europe felt like stepping into an entirely new life. I woke in a furnished apartment, arranged by the relocation team's sunlight, filtering through tall windows, the hum of traffic faint in the distance. No calendar alerts on Richard's phone, no reminders of parties I didn't want, no sighs about my clothes or my cooking, just me, strong coffee, and a city waiting to be walked. For the first time in years, I belonged only to myself, and yet the quiet was not without weight. Freedom carried its own echoes. 2 days later, those echoes found me in the form of an email. I had kept my old account open just long enough to monitor the aftermath, though my new number and work email were clean slates. His first messages arrived blistering demands, accusations, long paragraphs insisting that I had humiliated him. By the end of that first night, the tone shifted. "We can fix this," he wrote. "I'll forgive you if you come back." Reading those words, I felt a sharp mix of anger and disbelief. Forgive me. As though leaving was an offense, as though surviving without him required pardon. The messages multiplied by the hour. When silence stretched too long, others joined in. Chloe sent a wall of text accusing me of being heartless, of destroying the man who had given everything for me. Richard's mother wrote too dripping disappointment into every line. "Relationships are sacrifice," she said. "He needed you." I stared at the words, my hands tightening against the desk. For 5 years, I had given up my wardrobe, my friends, my sanctuary. I had given and given until there was nearly nothing left of me. And still, it wasn't enough. Their version of sacrifice was one-directional, and I was done with it. The most chilling attempt didn't arrive by email, but through my company. Andrew called me into his office with a careful look on his face. He explained that a woman had phoned, frantic, claiming there was a medical emergency with my mother. She demanded my new address and contact numbers, insisting it was life or death. My stomach dropped because I had spoken to Mom just that morning. She was fine reading by the window, telling me about her garden. The caller had given her name as Bianca, a woman Richard had once dated, someone I hadn't thought of in years. Whether it was her or Richard feeding her the lie, it was clear he was willing to use anything, even family emergencies, to claw his way back into my life. Andrew assured me that the staff had followed protocol and released nothing but the warning was there. My absence had not silenced him. It had driven him into desperation. That evening, I sat by the window of my apartment, city lights shimmering below, and tried to steady my breath. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was danger. Richard had crossed into something darker, something that sought to pull me back, no matter the cost. The fear was real, but alongside it came resolve. If he wanted to fight, he would learn I wasn't the fragile figure he believed me to be. I was steel reinforced with every slight, every dismissal, every quiet night where I told myself to endure. I had endured long enough. Now I would defend. The phone rang 2 days later, an unfamiliar number lighting the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Chloe's voice snapped sharp on the line. She demanded I fix what I had broken, that Richard was half alive on her couch, unable to eat or sleep. I let her talk, steadying myself, then answered with a calm she didn't expect. I told her his life was his own responsibility, that his belongings were safe, that he had the key and the access. I reminded her that his attempt to manipulate my company had been documented. If he tried again, it would not be me answering, but legal counsel. Her silence crackled through the phone. She hadn't known. I ended the call with finality, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. But the tremor wasn't fear anymore. It was release. For the first time, I had spoken truth without softening it, and I hadn't bent under her pressure. Still, Richard's persistence found new paths. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived forwarded through corporate legal. A formal claim from his attorney, thick with accusations. Wrongful abandonment, financial sabotage, emotional distress. He demanded palimony despite the fact we were never married, and most absurd of all, half the value of my architectural models. The same models he had mocked for years as dusty toys were now jointly owned art assets of significant worth. I laughed out loud when I read it, the sound hollow in the quiet apartment. It was audacity disguised as grievance, arrogance sharpened into legal threats. I sent the letter to corporate legal, and their reply was swift. They dismantled each claim point by point. We were never married, never shared accounts, never signed joint leases. The apartment lease was in my name, a loan termination notice filed properly. His belongings were carefully stored under his name, rent prepaid for months. Far from sabotage, I had safeguarded him. And then came the final strike. They documented his fraudulent call to my company, the harassment through proxies, the repeated invasions of privacy. Any further action, they warned, would trigger a formal harassment complaint. It was precise, surgical, devastating. When I finished reading, my hands stopped shaking. The structure held. Silence followed. A week later, his attorney sent a single sentence. Our client withdraws all claims. No apology, no concession, just retreat. But retreat carried consequences. Through Maya, I heard the ripples later. His legal bills had to be paid out of pocket. The storage rent I had prepaid ran out after 3 months, and he couldn't keep up. All his curated possessions ended up crammed into his parents' garage, stacked between holiday boxes and old lawn chairs. Chloe's patience frayed too. Hosting him on her couch wasn't permanent. By the time winter came, the man who once controlled every detail of my life was unraveling in the suburbs, stripped of his stage, his audience, his props. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't need to. What I felt was steadiness, the quiet assurance of having built something that could not be shaken. He had tried rage, manipulation, lies, and law, and still I stood. His world had collapsed under its own weight, because it was never built on foundation, only on facade. Yet I knew his story wasn't finished. Men like Richard rarely walked away quietly, and the echo of his persistence lingered at the edges of my new life. I poured another cup of coffee, stared out at the foreign skyline, and told myself to hold steady still. The breaking point had passed, but the final reckoning was yet to come. News of Richard's retreat spread quietly, reaching me not through him, but through the people who once surrounded him. Maya called one evening, her voice cautious, as though weighing whether I wanted to know. She explained that his lawyer's bills had drained him faster than he expected, that after the 3 months of storage I had prepaid, he couldn't keep up the fees. Everything he once displayed so proudly in our apartment, his art, his wine rack, the suits he treated like trophies, had been hauled into his parents' garage. The image came to me so clearly. Those objects stacked between plastic tubs of holiday decorations and dusty lawn chairs, the centerpiece of his carefully curated world reduced to clutter in a suburban corner. Maya hesitated before adding that Chloe's patience had run out too. Her couch, once the stage for his despair, was no longer available. She had told him to leave after weeks of listening to the same story on repeat, his voice full of blame but never ownership. By then, his circle of friends had grown smaller, people stepping back as the shine wore off. Without parties to host or connections to offer, he was simply a man unraveling, and even those loyal to him grew tired. Listening to Maya, I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. What came instead was an odd, distant pity, like watching a storm finally burn itself out over the horizon. At work, the pace of the project consumed me. Long days blurred into late nights, but the exhaustion felt different than before. It wasn't the fatigue of compromise or suppression. It was the honest tiredness of work that mattered, of problems solved and progress made. My colleagues saw me not as someone polished by another, but as the one leading, delivering, deciding. The respect was quiet but steady, and it nourished me more than I realized I needed. I found myself walking home each night with a lighter step, knowing the bridges I was building would stand longer than the echoes of Richard's disapproval. My apartment grew into a reflection of me, not him. Soft rugs, underfoot shelves lined with books and models, the warm clutter of a life lived with choice. I had brought the Golden Gate miniature across the ocean, its cables taut and gleaming in the light, a reminder of both my past endurance and my present strength. I started a new model too, the Pont de Normandie, sweeping arches stretching across a foam base, each evening's work a meditation. Threading the cables, sanding the edges, sketching adjustments. It was tedious, patient work, and it anchored me. Every piece I added was a declaration that I was building something new, not just in wood and wire, but in myself. Richard's name still surfaced now and then. Maya heard stories through old acquaintances, stories of him juggling 2 jobs to keep afloat, of his complaints filling every conversation. He told anyone who would listen that I had ruined him, painted me as manipulative, selfish, cold. But what stood out most was what he never said. He never took responsibility, never admitted to the years of control, never acknowledged the part he played in his own collapse. His fight was no longer with me. It was with the mirror. And that was a battle he was losing. I thought I would feel more satisfaction knowing this, but instead, I felt distance. Hatred would have tethered me to him, still kept me bound by anger. What I felt now was something else, a quiet detachment. His downfall was his own making, and I didn't need to carry it with me. My life no longer revolved around him, and that was the real victory. The revenge was not in watching him fall, but in standing whole again, in building a life that bore no trace of his hand. One evening, as I adjusted the final cables on the model bridge, I realized why this work mattered so much. Bridges are about connection, about enduring weight, and weather, about standing firm against time. But they only last when built on solid foundation. Richard and I had no foundation, only a facade of style and control. That was why we crumbled. My new life, slow and patient, was different. Each choice was deliberate, each piece placed with care, each cable tightened against real strength. I was building not for show, but for endurance. The quiet of my apartment that night was filled with more than silence. It was filled with peace, with the steady hum of a life reclaimed. Richard had once told me I couldn't survive without him. But here I was, thriving without the weight of his shadow, standing stronger than I ever had before. The blueprint of my escape had become the structure of my freedom, and every day that passed made it sturdier. Yet as I stood by the window, watching the city lights stretch across the horizon, I knew my story with Richard wasn't fully closed. His voice, though distant, still carried through others. His bitterness lingered, and the echoes of his interference had not gone completely quiet. The collapse of his world had come, but there remained one final reckoning, one last test of whether he would let go or whether I would have to make sure he could no longer touch mine. The last time I heard Richard's name was in passing through Maya. She mentioned it almost offhand, the way you might comment on the weather. He was still drifting, still telling anyone who would listen that I had ruined him. But his voice carried less weight now, even among those who once believed him. Without his stage, without the polished life he curated, he had become another man, complaining at the edges. That was when I realized the battle was finally over. Not because he admitted defeat, but because I no longer needed him to. Life moved forward in quiet, steady ways. My apartment grew into a reflection of who I truly was, not what someone else wanted me to be. Sunlight pooled across the shelves where my models stood proudly, each one a testament to patience and endurance. The Pont de Normandie dominated the corner, still unfinished but beautiful in its rise. Every evening I spent threading cables or sketching adjustments, reminded me that resilience is built piece by piece. What Richard once dismissed as childish had become the clearest symbol of who I was. Steady hands, quiet persistence, and strength that didn't require permission. At work, the bridge project flourished. The pace was relentless, but it filled me with energy rather than dread. I was leading now, not shadowed, not second-guessed. My colleagues respected me for my voice, my vision, not because I fit an image someone else curated. I walked into meetings with confidence, not because Richard had dressed me for them, but because I knew the worth of my own ideas. Each day I spent on that project felt like reclaiming another part of myself, another step further from the years I spent being diminished. Richard's downfall reached me in fragments. His possessions scattered, his circle of friends gone. His pride reduced to complaints no one wanted to hear. He had mistaken control for love and image for foundation, and when I left, everything collapsed. I thought I would feel satisfaction watching from afar, but what I felt instead was distance. Hatred or triumph would have tied me to him still. Pity was lighter, and distance was freedom. The storm that once terrified me was now just a memory of thunder. What surprised me most was how whole I felt. 6 months after leaving, I could sit by my window with a glass of wine watching the city lights and feel at peace. The silence no longer pressed in, it soothed. I didn't measure myself by what I had escaped, but by what I was building. My models, my work, my friendships. Even the simple joy of a morning unshaped by someone else's demands, all of it reminded me that dignity isn't restored in a single act of defiance. It's reclaimed slowly, day by day, by choosing to live as yourself again. Looking back, I see now that my revenge was never really about punishing him. It wasn't about watching his world fall apart or hearing the stories of his struggle. My real revenge was in proving to myself that I could thrive without his scaffolding, that I was never fragile steel, but reinforced concrete. Every step I took away from him built the life I have now, a life that is mine alone. And that is the justice I will carry forward. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is that love without respect is not love at all. Control is not care, and silence is not peace. We are stronger than the stories others try to write for us. And sometimes The quietest, most powerful act of justice is to step away and build something no one can take from you. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.